Imagine the day after Hari Raya. The city is still buzzing, the traffic is gone, and almost every door is open for forgiveness and Rendang. It's a 2-day national holiday, extended by most companies, and a whole week off for schools. This is the full beam of Malaysian celebration. Vibrant, inescapable, and nationally prioritized. Yeah, picture Deepavali. The date is October 20th. For the family next door, the one day of public holiday, one single day, is a frenzy. The oil lamps are lit, the kolam is rushed, the traditional herbal oil bath happens at dawn, and then for so many of them, it's straight back to work or school the very next day. They're celebrating the triumph of light over darkness, but they're doing it largely in the shadows of their own tight schedules, often having to take unpaid annual leave just to fully honor their faith. And the contrast doesn't stop there. Chinese New Year gets 2 days off nationally. Gawai Dayak in Sarawak, an essential harvest festival for the indigenous Dai community, gets 2 days off, but only in that state. Yet Christmas, marking the birth of Christ, often gets only 1. That striking, visible difference in the national calendar, 2 days for some, only 1 for others. It's not just a scheduling quirk. It holds a subtle, almost heartbreaking truth. It begs the question, in a country that proudly proclaims its unity and diversity, does the national calendar silently tell a story that certain lights are simply allowed to shine brighter than others? This is an investigation not into who is right or wrong, but into how a nation's true priorities can be read year after year in the quiet imbalance of its holidays.
Wow, that's a really powerful way to frame it. Reading a nation's soul, almost. Just by looking at its calendar, it really makes you think about how priorities, resource allocation, time, recognition, energy are decided.
Right. It's all laid out there.
Yeah, and often silently, maybe even unintentionally sometimes, but the imbalance is there.
Yeah.
And it definitely goes way beyond just holidays, doesn't it? You start thinking about cultural policies, media coverage, how all that shapes which traditions get the spotlight and which ones feel, less seen.
Exactly. That national calendar, it's like a blueprint for strategic decision-making on a huge scale.
Yeah.
But it got us thinking, if we can see national priorities that clearly, what about our own priorities?
Yeah, the personal level.
Yeah, the hidden ones, the internal drives, maybe even the psychological imbalances that are secretly steering our big life choices, careers, money, all of it.
Okay, I see where you're going. Using that same lens, looking at the structure to understand the hidden priorities.
Precisely. So that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to use the material we've gathered to really investigate these invisible psychological forces behind our strategic decisions.
Yep.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Right.
All right, so first up, we're diving into how ordinary people, lay people, make strategic decisions. The example here is a big one. Deciding whether or not to enroll in higher education.
Yeah, and what's really interesting about this particular model is how it starts. It doesn't just jump into problem solving.
Right. Most models kind of assume you already know there's a decision to be made.
Exactly. But this one introduces the idea of causes or triggers. You have to first recognize the cause. Maybe it's realizing your current job isn't going anywhere, or you need new skills. That's the trigger.
And if you don't recognize that trigger,
then you don't even start the decision-making process. The lack of a decision, not enrolling, becomes an action in itself, a missed opportunity, basically, with real consequences down the line.
Okay, so it starts with recognizing the cause. Then, according to this framework, that cause sparks 3 things at once.
Sort of simultaneously, yeah. It triggers thinking about alternatives. What are my options? It triggers evaluation. How do I judge these options? And crucially, it triggers emotions.
Emotions right from the start. Interesting.
Absolutely. And then those 3 streams, alternatives, evaluation, emotions, they all flow together and influence the final decision.
And it doesn't stop there, does it? There's a feedback loop.
Right. After the decision, you get the consequences, and those consequences, plus how you feel about them, the emotional enhancement, lead to this final appraisal. You look back and think, was that the right move? It feeds back into future decisions.
It sounds much more dynamic and frankly messier than a simple pro-con list.
Oh, definitely. And the researchers themselves pointed out something really key. The link between generating alternatives and evaluating them. It's fuzzy.
Fuzzy. What does that mean in practice?
It means we don't really separate those 2 steps cleanly. The ideal rational model is list all options neutrally, then apply your criteria. But this suggests the criteria you'll eventually use for evaluation are already shaping which alternatives you even think of.
So you're filtering options before you even realize you're evaluating.
Pretty much. Like if one of your deep down criteria is I need to stay close to home, You might subconsciously dismiss amazing opportunities elsewhere before they even make it onto your mental list.
Wow. Okay. So bias creeps in right at the beginning.
Absolutely. Your evaluation criteria are kind of like gatekeepers for the alternatives themselves. The goalposts are shifting even as you're trying to figure out the game.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, this study also looked at short-term versus long-term thinking in these decisions, right?
Yes, they tested two models. Model 1 focused on short-term benefits, and Model 2 looked at the long-term ones.
And what did they find? Was one easier to explain?
Well, the choices based on short-term evaluation Model 1 were somewhat easier to explain based on what people remembered and reported. Things like, I took this short course because it gave me an immediate pay bump.
Okay, that tracks. It's easier to connect the dots when the reward is immediate. Cause and effect is really clear.
Exactly. The gratification is right there. It's easier to recall and articulate that motivation.
But I sense a but coming.
There is a but. Because even though the short-term motivations were clearer, the ultimate decision, the big strategic choice about whether to enroll or not, that was actually better explained by the model focusing on long-term benefits, Model 2.
So even if we find it harder to talk about, the long game is what's really driving the major decisions.
That's what the data suggests.
Yeah.
It seems like our truly pivotal life choices are fundamentally geared towards a more distant future, even if we gravitate towards explaining things in terms of immediate payoffs. The catch is, those deep, long-term drivers, they're harder to pin down when we try to look back. They're quieter, maybe more subconscious.
Okay, this is where it starts getting really psychologically deep, especially when we bring emotions back into it. We often think of big goals as positive aspirations, right? I want this promotion. I want a better future. But the research on negative emotions, or Nemo, paints a different picture.
It really does. This Nemo finding dominantly negative emotions is maybe one of the most striking things here. The study found that the slight negative impacts on decisions and satisfaction that came from financial and social causes, well, those impacts were mediated by Nemo.
Mediated by negative emotions.
Oh.
Unpack that a bit.
It means that when strategic decisions involved tricky financial trade-offs, like maybe taking a lower-paying job to gain valuable experience, or difficult social ones, like moving away from your support network for an opportunity, the underlying emotional push wasn't necessarily, I'm excited about the potential gain.
It was more.
It was more like, I need to avoid future financial insecurity, or I'm anxious about missing out or stagnating socially. The negative feelings, fear, anxiety, the desire to mitigate potential pain or loss seem to be the real engine driving those tough strategic moves.
So we're strategically motivated by running away from bad stuff, not just running towards good stuff.
In many key situations, especially involving financial and social pressures, that seems to be a major factor. Think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, maybe. Our brains are wired to detect threats. Avoiding the lion might be a stronger imperative than dreaming about a slightly better hunting ground over the hill.
That's a really powerful analogy. Survival instincts kicking in for career planning.
Perhaps. It could explain why we default to mitigating risk. And it also helps make sense of the other big emotional finding in the study.
Which was?
The construct for P-mode dominantly positive emotions was the least explained part of both models. The reasons people gave for making the decision, the things related to wanting a better future, didn't strongly predict their positive emotional responses after the decision.
Wait, so wanting good things doesn't reliably make us feel good about the choices aimed at getting them?
It seems the connection isn't as strong or direct as we might assume. It's almost like the positive feelings are a nice bonus if things work out, but they aren't the core driver that gets the whole process started. That initial momentum, according to this, seems to come more reliably from a place of anxiety, fear of failure, fear of inadequacy, fear of missing out.
That's kind of bleak, but it also feels uncomfortably true sometimes. The pressure to avoid messing up can feel stronger than the pull toward success.
It suggests our strategic engines might be fundamentally fueled by a desire to reduce negative states, rather than purely maximize positive ones.
Okay, so if anxiety and avoidance are powerful undercurrents in our general life strategy, what happens when you focus that lens specifically on career ambition, particularly when things turn, well, unethical?
Right. Now we're shifting from broad life choices to the specific pressures of climbing the corporate ladder and why some people resort to unethical means to get ahead.
It's not just about wanting the job, is it?
No, the analysis we looked at points to something more specific. an overhyped, overemphasized interest in getting that senior position. It's not about the actual responsibilities or even just the salary. It's about the symbolic value the person attaches to the title, the status.
So the desire itself becomes inflated.
Hugely inflated. And that inflated value then seems to justify, in their mind, using unethical means to secure it. We're talking about actions that go beyond normal professional competition, things like sabotage, spreading lies, manipulating information.
Okay, so the ambition isn't the problem, it's the intensity and the value placed on the outcome that twists things. The material links this to an egoistically oriented personality and concepts like secondary narcissism. Can you break that down?
Sure. Think about the ego's role. As people achieve some success, their sense of self can get really tied up in external validation, job titles, promotions, recognition. Secondary narcissism, putting it simply, is when the ego sort of withdraws energy from the outside world and focuses it intensely back on itself, on its own perceived importance and needs. So in this context, the job position isn't just a job anymore. It becomes massively inflated, almost like a crucial piece of evidence proving their self-worth. It's inappropriately valued.
And their whole identity gets wrapped up in getting that title.
Exactly. And if getting that title feels threatened, the ego perceives it as an existential threat. That desperation, that perceived threat to their very self-image can then lead them to choose unethical actions because, from their distorted perspective, the stakes feel incredibly high.
The job title becomes a kind of psychological life support. That really helps explain why someone seemingly rational might do manipulative things.
It does, and it sets up a really interesting contrast with other ways of thinking about ambition, because not all ambition leads down this path. The material touches briefly on Nietzsche's ethics, specifically the will to power.
Now, we need to be careful with that term, right? It's often misunderstood as just pure selfishness or ruthlessness.
Absolutely. It gets misused a lot. Nietzsche's will to power isn't really about dominating others in a crude, egoistic way. It's more about self-overcoming, growth, striving to realize one's potential, questioning existing values to see if they actually help humans flourish.
So it's about mastering oneself rather than just getting ahead of others?
That's a much better way to put it. The unethical competitor we were just discussing is driven by fear of not having the status, fear of the ego being diminished. It's defensive. Nietzsche's ideal is more affirmative, a drive towards strength, creativity, self-mastery. He often looked back to Homeric ideals, actually.
Ah, like the heroes in the Iliad or Odyssey.
Exactly. Think about figures like Odysseus or Achilles. They certainly acted assertively, pursued glory, maybe acted as they pleased in some ways, but they operated within a framework. They still had duties to the gods, to their people, to certain codes of honor. They were obliged to fulfill those duties even while striving.
Whereas the unethical corporate climber seems to jettison any sense of duty beyond serving their own ego needs.
Precisely. Their focus narrows entirely to securing that external validation, that title, for purely narcissistic reasons. They lack that broader sense of obligation or constructive purpose.
So it really boils down to the internal priority driving the ambition. Is it a narrow, fearful, self-serving priority, or something more expansive, focused on self-mastery within a framework of responsibility?
That's the core distinction, and it determines whether that drive leads to something constructive or something ultimately destructive.
That tension you just described between sort of duty and self-interest is actually a perfect segue into our next area. We're looking at what really motivates people when they make the huge career commitment. Specifically, why do people choose to join the military? We're looking at the Czech Armed Forces here using the Moscow's model.
Ah, yes, the Moscow's model. It's a really useful framework for exactly this kind of question because it creates a clear contrast. It separates institutional factors, which are about the organization's mission, its values, its ethics, the duty side, if you will.
But the bigger purpose.
Right. And it contrasts those with occupational factors, which are all about the personal benefits, the job perks, the salary, career progression, the stuff that makes it competitive as just, well, a job.
Duty versus the paycheck, essentially.
Oversimplified, but yeah, that's the core tension it explores.
So let's start with the institutional side. For these Czech recruits, what were the big duty or mission factors that drew them in?
The findings were pretty clear on this. The top institutional drivers were really centered on high moral ground. Things like ethical and moral obligations came up strongly. Also, a sense of pride in being a soldier, pride in citizenship, feeling a responsibility for defending the country, providing security.
And liking order and discipline, too.
Yes, that was in there as well. It all points to a strong identification with the collective mission, with the values and purpose of the institution itself. It's about serving something larger than oneself.
Okay, so that's the high-minded part. Now, what about the occupational factors, the practical, what's in it for me side?
Well, those were definitely important too, and quite pragmatic. The number one occupational factor was Social Security. Meaning the basics. A regular salary, good health care, knowing you have job security. These are classic risk reduction benefits, right?
Yeah.
Maybe connects back to that Nemo idea of avoiding instability.
Makes sense. What else on the occupational side?
Close behind Social Security were opportunities for professional growth and career development. Then came things like good working conditions, chances for self-realization, an interest in the actual military tech and equipment, earning potentially more than in civilian jobs, and the chance to travel or serve abroad.
That's a pretty solid list of benefits. Sounds like a competitive employer package.
It does. They need to be competitive on that front.
So you have these strong pulls from both sides, the mission and the personal benefits. Which one ultimately seemed to carry more weight in the decision to join?
According to the research, despite how important those occupational factors clearly were, the salary, the security, the growth, the general motivation for joining was found to be based, more importantly, on the institutional factors.
So duty wins out.
It seems to be the primary driver, yes. That sense of ethical purpose, national pride, the mission itself, that was the core reason. But, and this is crucial, the occupational factors absolutely confirm their importance too. You can't just run on patriotism alone.
You need both.
You need both. The institutional factors provide the meaning, the why, but the occupational factors provide the means, the stability, the resources, the opportunities for growth that allow someone to actually pursue that meaning sustainably. It's a balance.
It's interesting, too, how these motivations aren't static. The research compared current recruits to surveys from around 20 years ago.
Yes, back in 1999 to 2002. And they found some key shifts.
What's changed?
Modern recruits put a lot more emphasis on things like professional development, self-realization, feeling like their work is useful, and even the sense of adventure.
And less emphasis on
things like wanting power or just joining because it's a family tradition. Those seem to have faded significantly.
So it's like a shift towards more individualistic motivations, even within a collective institution. More focus on personal growth and meaning alongside the mission.
That's a good way to put it. They still buy into the institutional mission, but they also expect the institution to facilitate their own personal journey, their self-development. It reflects broader societal changes, probably.
And there was one specific motivation they tested for that wasn't a factor, right? Something about unemployment.
That's right, and it's a really important finding. They specifically looked into whether people were joining the military simply to avoid being unemployed, using it as a safety net.
Yeah.
That idea was not confirmed. It wasn't a significant motivator. People weren't joining out of desperation because they couldn't find other work.
That says something about the recruits, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests they're joining for proactive reasons, that blend of mission and personal growth we talked about, not just reacting to a bad economy. It points towards a more intentional, possibly higher quality pool of applicants who are choosing this path for positive reasons.
Okay, so we've seen how these internal priorities, whether it's avoiding negative outcomes or embracing institutional duty, shape huge life choices like education and career. Now, let's pivot to maybe the most seemingly rational area, money. How do these psychological quirks play out when we're making investment decisions?
Behavioral finance. Yeah, this is where we see just how much our internal wiring can undermine supposedly logical choices. We looked at research on German investors and the impact of cognitive biases.
Cognitive biases, those mental shortcuts our brains take.
Exactly. They're often subconscious, deeply ingrained ways of thinking that can lead us straight into irrational financial decisions. The study focused on three big ones: overconfidence, representativeness, and herding.
All right, let's quickly define those so everyone's on the same page. Overconfidence.
That's pretty much what it sounds like. Believing you're smarter, better informed, or more skilled at investing than you actually are. It leads people to trade too much, take on risks they don't fully understand, and generally underestimate the chances of being wrong.
Okay. And representativeness.
Representativeness bias is when you judge the likelihood of something based on how similar it seems to a pattern or stereotype you already have in your head, even if that similarity is statistically meaningless.
Can you give an example in investing?
Sure. Like assuming a stock must be a winner just because it's in a hot sector like AI or green energy, ignoring the company's actual financial health or valuation. You're reacting to the story, the representation, not the underlying facts.
Got it. And the last one, herding, following the crowd.
Pretty much. It's the tendency to mimic what the majority of other investors are doing, usually driven by fear, either fear of missing out, FOMO, if everyone else is buying, or fear of being left holding the bag if everyone else is selling. It completely undermines independent thought and analysis.
Okay, so 3 common ways our brains lead us astray with money. Now, the really fascinating part was the demographic breakdown. Who is most prone to these biases? Let's start with gender.
Yeah, the gender findings were quite stark, and they align with a lot of other behavioral finance research. In the study of German investors, men were found to be more prone to all 3 biases: overconfidence, representativeness, and herding compared to women.
All 3. Wow. Any theories why?
Well, it could be linked to differences in general risk tolerance, maybe how genders tend to assess their own abilities, or even societal expectations. But whatever the reason, the data here showed men exhibiting these irrational tendencies more strongly.
Okay, a clean sweep there. What about age? Does getting older and presumably more experienced help?
Age showed a really interesting split. Younger investors defined here as under 35 were significantly more likely to fall prey to overconfidence and representativeness.
The classic, I've figured out the market syndrome.
Kind of, yeah. Thinking they see patterns others miss, or overestimating their ability to pick winners based on current trends. But here's the twist. Older investors over 35 were found to be at greater risk of the herding bias.
Really? Older investors herd more. I might have guessed the opposite, maybe younger investors following social media hype.
It's counterintuitive, isn't it? The thinking might be that as youthful overconfidence fades, it gets replaced by a different kind of fear, the fear of being wrong, the fear of standing out from the consensus. So older investors might retreat to the perceived safety of the crowd.
Fascinating. Okay, now for 2 factors we often think should protect us: experience and education level.
And this is where things get really surprising and maybe a bit humbling. First, experience. As you might expect, a less experienced investors under 5 years in the market did show higher levels of bias. That makes sense.
Okay, learning curve.
But the shocker was education. Investors with a higher education level, specifically a university degree, also tended to show these biases more strongly.
Wait, more education leads to more bias, not less. How does that work?
Well, one strong theory is that higher education can sometimes breed a specific kind of intellectual overconfidence. You have the analytical skills, you understand complex models, and you might start believing you can genuinely outsmart the market or find an edge that others can't.
So your education makes you think you're less biased, which actually makes you more susceptible to biases like overconfidence.
Exactly. You trust your own sophisticated reasoning, maybe over simpler, more prudent strategies. It's a stark reminder that intelligence and rationality aren't the same thing, especially when ego gets involved.
That's a huge takeaway. Okay, one last factor, trading frequency. Does being more active in the market help or hurt?
According to this data, it definitely hurts. Investors who traded more frequently, defined as more often than every 3 months, showed higher levels of all 3 biases.
Overconfidence, representativeness, and herding.
All of them. It seems the more decisions you make under pressure, the more chances you give those underlying biases to take the wheel and influence your choices. Frequent trading looks less like active management and more like frequent bias expression.
So the big picture here is, we're fundamentally pretty irrational when it comes to money, aren't we? These biases are deep.
They seem deeply ingrained, yeah. Almost subconscious drivers that can override logic. Even for people who are experienced or highly educated, they're almost dictating choices.
And I guess big external events like market crashes or pandemics probably amplify all this.
Absolutely. The study mentions how things like the pandemic and inflation crises create huge swings in market sentiment. That kind of volatility just pours fuel on the fire of emotional decision-making, likely making biases like herding and fear-based representativeness even stronger. It makes studying this stuff complex, too, because the backdrop is always changing.
There was also a really honest point made by the researchers about their own methods, wasn't there? About the difference between a survey and real life.
Yes, and it's critical. They acknowledge that someone filling out a questionnaire about hypothetical investment scenarios is likely feeling calm, rational, maybe even trying to present themselves as logical.
But that's not like making a real trade with your own money on the line.
Not at all. When real money is at stake, when you're feeling that pressure, that anxiety, maybe that Nemo state we talked about earlier, people are likely far more impulsive, far more prone to these biases than they'd ever admit or even realize in a calm survey setting.
So the results we've discussed might actually be understating how irrational we are in the real world.
It's very possible. It highlights the huge gap between how we think we make strategic decisions and how we actually make them when the pressure's on. Hashtag, outro.
We started this whole deep dive looking at Malaysia's national holiday calendar, seeing how that visible structure reveals hidden priorities about cultural recognition and resource allocation.
Yeah, that imbalance between the different celebrations.
Exactly. And we've ended up finding that same pattern of hidden priorities and psychological imbalances running right through our own personal lives. Choosing college, chasing promotions, managing investments.
It's all driven by these internal structures, these hidden calendars in our minds.
Absolutely. Our decisions are shaped by these forces we barely recognize. We've seen how those big life strategies might actually be fueled by trying to avoid negative feelings, that Nemo concept, rather than just chasing positive goals.
And how ambition can curdle into unethical behavior when the ego inflates the value of a position, losing sight of any sense of duty, unlike those Homeric ideals we touched on.
And even getting a good education doesn't make us immune to irrational financial traps like overconfidence or following the herd. Our internal logic just gets overruled.
It really seems our true inner workings are shaped by these quiet pressures, anxiety, ego defense, those subconscious mental shortcuts. Left rational calculation, more psychological reaction.
So understanding that is the real work, isn't it? Peeling back the layers to see what's actually driving us.
That self-awareness has to be the starting point. If you want a life that feels genuinely equitable, balanced, flourishing, you need to grapple with the why behind your choices, not just the what.
Knowing if ambition is driven by insecurity or if a financial strategy is really about avoiding fear.
Exactly. Recognizing those influences, the secondary narcissism, the Nemo effect, that's how you move from just reacting to actually making intentional choices, like those Greek heroes, maybe finding strength and making choices within a framework of understanding your own nature and duties, not just being pushed around by unseen forces.